So it's my pleasure to introduce Laura Starks, President of the American Finance Association. Today she will give a presidential address. Laura is a pillar for the AFA and also to the finance profession more generally. Laura is the George Kosmetsky Centennial University Distinguished Chair Professor at the University of Texas at Austin, where she also did her undergraduate studies, and she's a loyal Texian, if I may say so. I will introduce Laura first by describing her research, then her service, and then the broader impact she made to the world. So Laura's research covers a range of topics, on mutual funds, retirement plans, and so forth, and can roughly characterized in three phases. First, she focused more on the asset pricing side on mutual funds and contracting tournaments. Then she focused more on empirical work on CEO compensations, corporate governance, and shareholder activism. And the final phase, I would say, she focused very much on ESG research and greenwashing. And she did this research before these terms were even invented. So she was really one of the early movers and shakers in this field in ESG measurements, climate risks, and diversity issues, and so forth. For this, she also got the 2021 Moskowitz Prize, a global prize for the research of sustainable finance. She has a very broad command of a broad field, but what really stands out is, going deep in institutional knowledge as well. So that's what I would like to say about research. And then what also stands out is Laura's academic service. It's also very exemplary. She deeply cares about and watches out for her colleagues quite a lot. She's a terrific mentor of PhD students and in the programs and also when they're in the program and also afterwards in their career. And one example is just one of her first students, Jay Hatzel, is now the president of UT. And that's, just shows what she has done in the broader academic community. So Laura's leadership style is essentially to step up the plate when it's needed. She was department chair, she was interim dean, so she did a lot of services. She was also editor of the RFS and associate editor for many other finance journals, including of our JAF. So in terms of broader impact beyond the finance profession, in academic finance profession, she of course is also sitting on many boards. So if you are in retirement funds or invested in TAA-GRAF and you make good returns on it to some extent and there's no scandal, it is also because of Laura. She makes sure that it's not everything is invested nicely. So she was in the FTSE Russell Academic Advisory Board, many other funds, and also independent director and TAA-GRAF mutual funds. But I think what really stands out are her personal qualities. And I asked around a little bit, and when I get responses like this, Laura is one of the smartest, kindest, and most gracious people that I've ever encountered in this profession. She is quite simply one of our favorite people on the planet. So it just shows something. So let me conclude by noting that Laura is a true blue Texan. She lives 70%, I was told, in a condo in downtown Austin. I was also told it was bought for her son. And that reflects her love for the urban side. And 30% in a ranch, reflecting the true Texan roots as well. She has a very good sense of humor and a calm demeanor, so which, we will see tonight as well. And ladies and gentlemen, Laura Starks, the presidential address is coming. The floor is yours. Thanks again.
Wow, that was such a nice introduction. None of it's true. So, okay, so not surprisingly, I'm going to talk about ESG. And I want to talk about sustainable finance and ESG, ES&G issues, values versus value. And before that, I want just some very brief thank yous. I didn't want to do it at the end because I get too excited. But first, I want to thank you, the AFA membership, for giving me the privilege of serving as president of AFA and giving this talk. I want to say a thank you to 3 UT PhD students that helped me a lot in preparing this talk. Linda Du, Alex Priest, and Lynn Yang. And Alex is on the market this year, and Linda and Lynn will be on the market next year. So everybody should watch out for them. And then, and this is similar to what Johannes said. I want to thank my co-authors on E, S, and G and related issues, and they've taught me so much. And I am not going to list all of these co-authors, but you can see them there. So there's a terminology that is developed around E, S, and G issues, and academic researchers, among others, do not agree on the meaning of sustainable finance or the acronyms ESG, SRI, RI, or CSR. These interrelated terms have been drawing increased attention from institutional and retail investors, regulators, politicians, corporate leaders, and their employees. And the central problem, and the one I want to focus on today, is not only the lack of clarity on the meaning of these terms, but also how the misunderstanding about these concepts could affect investors, corporations, asset markets, and regulations. Although increasingly research is being conducted in these areas, many issues remain incompletely addressed. Moreover, until we see more agreement on what the terms mean, the existing research needs to be considered in light of how the authors are framing the research questions. In effect, people are talking at cross purposes, and it is incumbent upon the finance research community to provide clear analyses and interpretations of these issues from a financial economics perspective. Given the controversies that have arisen regarding ESG, which I will address more fully later, the finance research community has the opportunity to present the facts. And for much of this talk, I'm going to provide my wishes for more research. So I have a lot of ideas for research that I would like to see people pursue, because there's so much that we still don't understand. And again, an important question has to do with the terminology. What is the correct term that should be used to describe this type of corporate decision-making and investing approach? Some prefer sustainabilities, while others prefer ESG, SRI, RI, or CSR. So throughout this talk, just for the ease of it, I'm going to be using the statement ESG. And the confusion comes from both investor and corporate manager perspectives. Previous corporate finance research has focused on either ESG or CSR have come up with conflicting hypotheses and conflicting results. For example, empirical evidence on the relationship between a firm's ESG profile and its markets, leadership, ownership characteristics, risk, performance, and value, all of those are very mixed in terms of what they conclude. So we need to understand these relationships better. And I think the major issue here is values versus value. And as I talk about this, I want to be very clear about one thing about the previous research. There has been a lot of amazing research that has already been conducted on E, S, and G issues. In fact, too much for me to cite here. And my slides I can't cite as much as the actual paper will have slided. So if I've left your paper out, it's not necessarily left out. So my interest here today is to focus on moving forward in this field, particularly given the misunderstandings and controversies that have arisen. So I want us to think about how finance researchers can contribute in the future to clearing up these misunderstandings by providing a deeper analysis of the issues. But I also think we need to consider the theoretical and empirical approaches to analyzing ES and G issues. I note that I will spend only a little time on the G part, the governance part of ESG, because that area is subject to less misinterpretation, although a number of items remain debatable. For example, we don't understand how and how much racial, ethnic, and gender diversity contributes to corporate leadership, including the board of directors, and to firm performance. So again, the major issue I want to talk about is values versus value. So if we think about for some investors and corporate managers, the ESG concept centers on values. ESG investing means investing according to their preferences, and in particular, their non-pecuniary preferences. And a variety of motivations can lead to this type of investment approach. It could originate from a desire not to be complicit in supporting objectionable corporate products or behavior. And I have objectionable in quotations because if I went around and asked each of you, what would you find objectionable, would find a whole variety of different areas that would be objectionable. So there is not an agreement. Non-pecuniary investor preferences vary from, for example, a desire for a low or zero carbon footprint to a portfolio based on animal rights, religious beliefs, or other types of preferences. Many academics, researchers, practitioners, politicians, and others think that the term ESG focuses exclusively on this values approach. But there's also a somewhat different ESG concept that centers on financial value. And under this concept, ESG corporate activities and ESG investing is presumed to focus on the risk or return opportunities that arise from looking at E, S, and G considerations, because these can affect firm value. So as academic researchers, we need to better incorporate the separation between these ESG concepts, although it gets more complicated because for some investors, they use both the values and the value. In fact, one can think of ESG investing as this linear Venn diagram from social responsibility to ESG investing to traditional investing. And the ESG investing has both those that have the values approach as well as those that have the value approach. So it could be either. And here I've also included impact investing. And if you think about it in terms of preferences, with impact investing, there's an intentional focus on E or S outcomes. And there's a non-pecuniary preferences there. Socially responsible investing usually comes from non-pecuniary preferences. With classic ESG investing, it's mixed preferences. Some of them are non-pecuniary and some of them are based on financial value. And then the traditional investing is usually based on financial value. So we have this difference in preferences that are both contained within ESG, which helps provide the misunderstandings. Also, if we think about expected returns with impact investing, the impact investors primarily are willing to pay. They're willing to give up some return because of this impact, but there are also some that aren't. They want to have impact, but they want to have a market return. With socially responsible investing, again, it's closer to market returns, but there are some that are willing to pay. With traditional investing, we think about that as just being people want market returns. And with this, what I call classic ESG investing, you have both. You have those that are willing to pay, and then you have those that expect market returns. So this causes confusion. I want to show you some ways in which we can see how much the interest in ESG has gone up. So this graph shows a Google Trends topics for the last decade, the same amount of time that Jim has been the executive secretary and treasurer. And Google Trends, this is a topic: environmental, social, and corporate governance is what they call it. And you can see how it has gone up over time. And we can compare this to corporate social responsibility as a topic, and which has been pretty steady over time. And the ES and G topic is about the same now as corporate social responsibility. But we can also look at socially responsible investing, which has enough interest that it is a Google Trends topic, but it has much smaller interest over time. And the other thing that's interesting about this is a worldwide Google Trends topic search. If I just use the United States, you see that compared to the ESG, the corporate social responsibility is overall a little lower, and ESG has gone much higher in the last few years. Also, you can Google Trends, you can do so much. If the people in different regions use different terms. And so this was a map that was constructed by Google, and it shows which term is the more prominent in each of the regions. And as you can see, there are lots of regions where people are looking up environmental, social, and corporate governance more. And then there are other regions where they're looking up corporate social responsibility more. Okay, another way of looking at the interest in ESG is what mutual fund managers are buying. So this graph shows active mutual fund ownership and company ESG scores. So the line is actually the difference in mutual fund ownership between the set of companies that are in the highest ESG quartiles and the set of companies that are in the lowest ESG quartiles. And as you can see over time, this difference has been going up. It's going up from negative difference, but it has been going up over time. So active mutual fund managers are buying more high ESG stocks over this time period. And you may say, well, this is because it's tech stocks, or this is because there are characteristics of these stocks that the managers are buying. So we can adjust this by the Daniels, Greenblatt, Titman, and Wormer characteristics, and we still get, it's not quite as smooth a line going up, but we still get this increasing line that's going up over this. And then if we look at the E scores by themselves, the S scores by themselves, and the G scores by themselves, in every case, we see that it's going up. So there is this interest by the active mutual fund managers. And I should also stress, this isn't restricted to ESG funds. This is all of the active mutual fund managers that are making these decisions. So what's needed is to better understand the drivers of this relationship and how much is due to values considerations versus value considerations. We also need to separate the motivations for ESG investing to understand it better, because motivations define the investment approach. So if we look at values, again, it's preferences, it's avoidance of complicity, it's not wanting to supply capital to businesses that you don't believe in or that you think are doing harm to the environment, which can cause economic damages. It's also maybe because you want to make an impact on the environment or society, so you're supplying capital to a business to do that, or you're engaging, having stewardship with a business because you want to change the way they're treating their employees or they're treating the environment. In terms of value, it's mainly risk management, reducing or understanding ESG risk exposures, and then return opportunities, investment selection, and again, engagement stewardship in order to try to make money. These are not clear boundaries, as many investors have combined motivations. Okay, so in terms of the theories of ESG investing and the values versus value, I would say there are two main types of theories. There's one that has a set of values investors with non-pecuniary preferences who buy the ESG stocks versus the financial investors. And typically the weightings of the proportion of non-pecuniary preferences are important in the equilibrium conditions. Other theories have the value investors as well as values investors that are buying ESG stocks. And so they're considering the financial motivations of ESG investing. But I think what's needed is more theoretical frameworks that consider the differences within the value investors and the differences within the value investors. There's lots of evidence on motivations for ESG investing. There's some surveys and experiments on Dutch investors that have taught us a lot, and Dutch pension fund participants, about their preferences in terms of SRI funds being held primarily due to social preferences and signaling, and there's limited financial motivation. That pension fund participants think their plans should engage in more responsible investing activities, and this is based on the participants' non-pecuniary preferences, according to the analysis, and investors' willingness to pay increases in their altruistic attitudes. There's also evidence that among Vanguard investors, Beyond the 42% with no interest in ESG investing, there exists heterogeneity, which is split between motives based on non-pecuniary preferences. It's the right thing to do was the question. Hedging climate risk, and then a smaller group, I think it was around 10%, that had financial return expectations from ESG investing. There's also an experiment that I did with some colleagues where we found that an asymmetry exists between investor views on negative versus positive externalities, and that this affects the asset allocation decision. There's more empirical evidence reflecting investor preferences in terms of both values and value, in terms of both retail and institutional investors. That shocks to funds' sustainability reputation suggest investors react to changes in ESG scores. Longer-term investors have stronger apparent preferences for the high-rated ESG stocks as compared to other investors. And ESG SRI mutual funds exhibit less performance sensitivity than other types of mutual funds. And I think we can learn something about institutional investor ESG motivations as reflected in their climate risk motivations. This was a survey I did with my colleagues Philip Kruger and Zach Sautner. And we asked their motivations for incorporating climate risk into investment decisions. And this included some of the largest institutional investors around the world. And I think we can classify these different ones into three different types. One is the motivations that have to do with value. So it's beneficial to investment returns, and then it reduces risk, either overall portfolio risk or tail risk. Two of them have to do with values. Is a moral ethical obligation and reflects their asset owners' preferences. And then one of them, I would argue, is a blend, protects our reputation. That could be value or values or both. And it's a legal obligation, fiduciary duty. There are corporate manager motivations, and we really need to understand this better because the frequent claims about greenwashing. So it'd be really helpful to get more research on corporate managers. Okay, I also want to show you some regional differences in ESG mutual fund investments. So on the left-hand side is the assets under management of non-ESG mutual funds worldwide. The blue is the US, the yellow is Europe, and the gray is other. And as you can see, the US has the largest amount of assets under management for non-ESG mutual funds. If you look at the right-hand side, this is the assets under management for ESG mutual funds by region. And I want to caution that these are not on the same scale. They're less ESG mutual funds. And it's Europe that's the dominant place for the ESG mutual funds. That little blue is the US. So there's this big regional difference. And you also see this with the ETFs. Again, a big regional difference in terms of the assets under management. The flows, it's the same thing. We see the blue is the US, non-ESG equity mutual funds, and the yellow is Europe. And we see this also with ETFs. Okay, so if we look at the ratio between ETFs, or the ratio of ETFs to mutual funds, assets under management, and how that's grown, I mean, this reflects how much ETFs have become more popular. So on the left-hand side, we can see in the US, the blue, that's equity, ETF mutual funds, ETF to mutual fund ratio, and the yellow is fixed income, but we can see them going up and going up separately, where fixed income is much lower. If we look at over in Europe, they're kind of going together in terms of the ESG the ESG ETF to mutual fund. And this can also, I think it's particularly striking in the US, where the ETF mutual fund assets under management ratio has now gotten to where it compares to the non-ESG ETF to mutual fund ratio. Okay, so then the question is, why these differences in market developments for ETFs, and particularly for ESG ETFs? And is it related to differences in values versus value across countries? Okay, I can't ignore this controversy about return performance in terms of value versus value perspectives. So we have research on the expectations in terms of willingness to pay. There's evidence of willingness to pay for ESG funds and for impact investors. There's also differences in terms of probability beliefs. So the values approach, the common hypothesis is you have negative screening. That means you're going to have a smaller investment opportunity set. So you have a constrained optimization. So how could ESG funds possibly outperform non-ESG funds or conventional funds? The value approach would say ESG incorporation can lower risk or return opportunities, so ESG portfolios would not be expected to earn lower returns and could potentially earn higher returns than conventional portfolios. There are thousands of studies, in fact, and they come up with all different results, and there's so many studies that meta-analyses have been done. But here's my question. Are we really asking the pertinent questions about return performance? ESG funds have different objectives, and I think this is highlighted if you just go through the ETFs, the ESG ETFs. These are examples of different objectives from ESG ETFs, from ETF focused on renewables, focused on social justice, focused on the Sustainable Development Goal impact, focused on integrates ESG, transition to energy future, circular economy, negative screening according to different religious values, and even ocean decarbonization technologies. How can these be combined into one sample of ESG funds for testing performance? We put these all together and we say, okay, do they beat non-ESG funds? I'm not sure what we learned from that analysis. And the same thing has to do with ESG funds underlying investment approaches. They can have differences in distribution systems as well as different benchmarks. So there are many different benchmarks for these. So again, how can we combine these and expect to learn something about the performance differences? The business processes versus outcomes. The values investors, there's more focus on the ultimate outcomes of businesses. And they often want to align with the Sustainable Development Goals, which are very broad and really have to do with what's happening to the environment and the society. Value investors have more focus on the business processes and the risk and return from those processes, but the Sustainable Development Goals could lead to risk for companies, for example, reputation or regulatory risk. So one example would be biodiversity risk. And there was a recent convention just a few weeks ago where they agreed to adopt the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And the goals of the framework are to address biodiversity loss and ecosystems and protect indigenous rights. And the 2030 goals, and this is what I want you to focus on here, require large and transnational companies and financial institutions to monitor, assess, and transparently disclose their risks, dependencies, and impacts on biodiversity through their operations, supply, and value chains and portfolios. This is a regulatory risk for companies, large companies, a reputational risk for large companies, and the financial institutions. So we as finance researchers can provide insights into how this risk is considered by financial markets. And as pointed out by Andrew Caroli and Tobin de la Puente, we need research to better understand these risks, how they might be priced, and how the financing of biodiversity goals can be achieved. So the question of corporate biodiversity risk can be considered more in depth by differentiating between the values and value perspectives. Why should we combine the ES and G into one thing called ESG? it's not necessarily the case that companies are doing this, they're doing the same thing on their environmental activities, their social activities, their governance activities. And if we look at how this is considered by some of the ESG rating services, we can see, for example, the first set here uses Sustainalytics scores from 2013 to 2017. Sustainalytics changed the way they did this in 2017, and they no longer do the separate ES and G scores. But back when they did it, you can see that it was a relatively low correlation between each of these. If we look at S&P Global over the same time period, it was a little bit higher correlation. And if we look at this compares the S&P Global over that earlier period, and then you can see where it has been coming closer together. But we need to think about, should we be looking at E, S, and G all separately? In terms of country differences, can we understand more about investor and corporate manager motivations and activities by examining country differences from the values and the value perspective? So I really like this graph. If you look at this, this shows the average environmental score by country, where the blue line is just a regular average score, and the orange line is where it's been industry adjusted. And if you look over to the right, you're going to see a lot of European countries. And if you look over to the left, you see other countries from other areas. And we see the same thing with the social scores and the same thing with the governance scores. And in fact, this map was constructed by Alex Priest. He colored it in. And it shows the E scores by country, and it shows where the dark green is the highest scores, and so far down to red. And you can see there's a big regional difference with Europe. And you can also see, if you use the Yale Environmental Performance Index and you plot it against the S&P Global E-score, just a very simple calculation. If you look over up in the right, it's all European. So the Yale Environmental Performance Index is capturing country policies, whereas the S&P Global E-score is capturing company policies and actions. So this is consistent with underlying country characteristics driving the differences in the company ESG or CSR scores, which has already been found in research. It's consistent with foreign investors' country social norms affecting portfolio firms' CSR. It's consistent with country cultural differences driving the growth of ESG industry, which has been found. And it's also consistent with country cultural differences driving executive compensation gender pay gap. In terms of shareholder activism, there have been important studies on the institutional investor activists who engage in firms on ENS, and Elroy Dimson with Caracas and Lee was one of the first to look under the engagement on these issues, and then they have also gone on to look at the collaborative engagements on these issues, and then people have looked at engagement on downside risk. One thing about this that I think is interesting, would be interesting to look at in more depth, is the motivations for some shareholder activists arise from a values orientation, and the motivations for other shareholder activists arise from a value in orientation. For example, the Engine Number 1 Fund and Exxon. So we should expect differences in engagements and results from the engagements, and our theories and empirical tests should reflect those differences. Another example of potential differences is, again, regional. When the first say on pay, and this is just anecdotal, but when the first say on pay proposals came out, for the US, it was primarily yes, 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 this is fine. For Europe, there were a lot of votes where it was, largely against the pay. So we need more analysis on the differences across investors, and Lowry, Wang, and Wei have done this for ESG funds with respect to holding periods, chosen risk exposure, and discretionary voting. So we need more of this type of research. Okay, so Johannes thought I was going to be talking about climate finance, and there's so much work on climate finance. I could have done the whole talk on climate finance. In fact, there are already PhD classes on climate finance. I mean, just this kind of work. And so what's needed is, and I don't want to keep you all too long. So I just want to point out that climate risk is not just an environmental risk. It's also a social and governance risk for companies and their investors. And we need to understand more the values versus value preferences about these risks. And there are lots of things we don't know about the risks. So we need a better understanding for given investors and companies regarding how much is due to financial concerns and how much non-pecuniary preferences. And I just want to highlight the divestment issue, because that's one of the ones that is causing a lot of the controversy. So there are theoretical and conceptual arguments about divestment and the effectiveness of exclusion for instituting change. And I'm not going to go through these arguments here. And there's also empirical evidence on exclusion divestment. And most of these theoretical and the empirical work has to do, suggest that exclusion divestment is not a good idea for investors. One exception is exclusion can be effective under certain conditions, including having E&S conscious institutional investors. And this is Marissa and Gonchieff and Lee. And this is the type of thing I think that we need more of, is looking at how the different types of investors, particularly values versus value investors, are reacting to this. But what if we consider divestment from a values versus value perspective? There are two perspectives for the values investors. There's the one group who don't want to provide capital to companies that they believe have harmful products or behavior. They just want the shares out of their portfolio. And my sister, it was lovely to come here from San Antonio. Years and years ago, we told our mother, please sell the tobacco stocks. We don't want to make any money from tobacco stocks. So this, it wasn't trying to change the company. It was just, we didn't want to be complicit with that. The other approach of values investors is actually they want to deprive a company of capital and consequently increase the company's cost of capital. And there's some of this research that I talked about before deals with that question. The value investors, they may just want to avoid risk. For example, stranded asset risk. So in theoretical and empirical considerations of divestment, we should acknowledge these differences, particularly for the value investors. And this relates to, you may have heard of people that say they're anti-ESG. And I don't know what that means. Are you against values investors' preferences? Are you against religious people not putting their money where they don't want it to be? Or are you against the value investors' risk and return analyses? Personally, I think it's nonsensical. And the anti-ESG ETFs are not raising much money. So this brings me to ESG and fiduciary duty. Should we as finance researchers or should government officials tell the value investors who don't want to be complicit that they should not invest according to their preferences if they're willing to pay? And this also raises a question about fiduciary duty. Should it really be antithetical to fiduciary duty to not allow people to invest according to their beliefs? What if offering ESG funds and defined contribution plans leads participants to save more toward their retirements? One of my colleagues told me that his mother had never invested in stocks, equity mutual funds, until they started offering ESG mutual funds because of her beliefs and her feelings. So, what we need is more considerations from a financial economics perspective of fiduciary duty with regards to ESG and values investors. And notice I have fiduciary duty in quotes here because I'm not talking about the legal. I'm talking about us from a financial economics perspective. Just real quick, social issues, what do we mean? They're not well defined. We need more work on the social issues. We need to be more precise in our definitions and in whether the issue is from a values or value perspective. I want to say a brief word, very brief, on governance issues. Can you really have good E&S without good G? But the problem is there exists a lot of disagreement on what is good G. So according to research, the average correlation across the ESG rating services for the G rating is around 30%, which is much lower than the E and the S. Fixed income is one where there's not a lot of research. Most of the focus on ESG theory and empirical evidence has been on equities. There's some influential work on fixed income and ESG, including green bonds, but much work still needs to be done, particularly with regards to the pricing, the question of a greenium. So D'Amico, Klausman, and Pancost have a paper looking at the greenium with respect to sovereign bonds, and we need to understand this better. This is actually my last point I want to make, which has to do with demographics. So demographics, ESG in the future, there's, the popular press talks about how millennials are all going into ESG. They only want ESG. There is some evidence that people are willing to work for less pay if they can work for a better company. How they define that. So I think it's important that we understand how age demographics can affect this. So in conclusion, what ESG means depends on the context. ESG values implies that non-financial factors are important. ESG value implies that the sustainable activities can be financially material, particularly for long-term investors. Risk management and return opportunities, including engagement, become important for the value investors. And considerations on what ESG means for corporate activities and investment decisions depends on which context is important to the managers and investors. And as researchers, we need to take these differences into account. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Laura. So now I have the pleasure to thank you for all your service you did for the AFA and beyond. And so I will give you plaque first. So I give you the plaque, which means once you're done with your job, you will be also a fellow of the American Finance Association. And that's for the fellowship. You will get something secret inside.
Okay, great.
And it's heavy.
And it's heavy.
So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Okay, it's now my pleasure to say I'm done with being president, and I get to give the gavel to Markus.
And the first task is a very nice task. I invite you all for the reception, one floor down, and I hope to see you all there for a nice reception and some intermingling and networking for all of us. Thanks again for coming, and thanks to everybody.